is taking the time to say, why did you choose this conversation? And then like running through these questions in a really staccato way. Instead, I encourage you to think about how these questions might inform or help us to understand what you chose to talk about. So as a reminder, right, this informal sharing of your progress and work on this final paper is from 8 a.m. Until 10 a.m. on the 15th next week. I know that this is outside of our regular meeting time since it's finals week, so make sure that you can attend calendar-wise. If you can't, contact me and I will send you a Zoom link. And if you can't do either of those things, please send me a 4 or 5 minute video prior to that date. That will be counted toward your grade in the course, so please make sure that you are prepared to share. And again, don't think about this as a stressful, formal presentation. Think about it as an opportunity to share with us what it is that you learned and did in this process. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you and what you've shared and put together. A couple notes too regarding the transcription process, right? So first of all, please make sure that before you start the recording, that you've received consent from the person that you're recording and be like, hey, you know, I have this class, I'm being asked to have a conversation and transcribe it. Is it okay if I record? You could record such as using your phone or computer, right? Using either audio or video, depending on what you want to capture. I do not recommend taking notes on like the dialogue as it's happening because you won't be in the moment at that time, right? Use transcription afterwards and use the time during the conversation to really focus on talking with the other person. This isn't really an interview, right? You might come in with some questions or some direction, but you're participating too, right? So you might use some entry questions as a way to have that conversation or relationship with the other person. So if all you're doing is asking questions, right, that doesn't necessarily involve your own participation in dialogue, which is the thing to think about for this conversation too. And then also remember, right, that the transcription, you can think of that kind of like a script for a play, right? You say X, they say Y. If it's useful for you to indicate things like nonverbal cues, like so-and-so nodded or rolled their eyes, that can be something you include if you want to, but you don't have to include the nonverbal stage directions. And then in addition to that, you might also consider if you prefer to anonymize or remove or change any confidential information, you can do that. For example, give somebody a code name, right? You could, if they're talking about somebody else, change that person's name. You can also, not include a part of the conversation that you feel like is not something that you are interested in sharing. So there's some options there about how you choose to share that information. So again, you can think about the 3 big things that you need as your 4-page essay where you're applying content from the back half of the course, including some things that we'll talk about for today. The transcript, right, which is separate from those 4 pages, and then a works cited that would include a formal MLA, APA, or Chicago citation from the Wrench, Mindful Approach to Communication textbook. I noticed, right, a lot of folks did a good job on citation, but if there's work that you need to still do on how to cite your sources, or you've got a note from me about citing sources and you need some additional help in doing that, please contact me and I'm happy to help with getting those citations working for you. So, in these last 2 kind of content-oriented classes, we'll be talking about essentially the dark side of interpersonal communication. So, I was mentioning to a colleague, it's kind of a sad way to end the quarter, but he was mentioning, it's defense against the dark arts, which I thought was a more fun way of thinking about it. It's understanding the negative and bad parts of interpersonal communication so that we can develop a strategy for dealing with that effectively. So on Monday, we talked about interpersonal communication in the workplace. This is great if you're choosing like a coworker or colleague. You might draw from some of that work in your final essay. But I think that what we talked about on Monday are also good practical skills and applications in thinking about the challenges of work, of changes to work, remote work, and so on. So we talked a little bit about that last class. And we'll be shifting gears to talk about some of the negative patterns of interpersonal communication. So in particular, we'll be talking about the ways that we might be deceptive, be unclear, or particularly in things like intimate or romantic relationships, the ways that negative patterns of communication can happen, with the hope that we can understand how to better respond to and deal with hurtful and negative communication that might come up. Before I do that, though, does anybody have any questions about the course in general, the final essay or informal presentation, or anything else? Great. So I know that we had a Canvas outage yesterday. So as I encouraged through an announcement on Canvas, right, I encourage you to double check if you submitted anything for any of your classes yesterday to make sure that that went through. You might also consider sending something as an email in case that outage impacted you. Please also remember to complete the instructor course evaluations that are available on Canvas, and you should have received email about. So we'll talk about some of these negative patterns of interpersonal communication. As a reminder, extra credit is due by the end of the day on Friday. It does require a little bit of upfront work to find an outside source related to interpersonal communication. So if you're planning on getting that extra 2% or 20 points onto your grade, I really recommend you get a good start on that if you haven't done so already. And then 8 a.m. to 10 is the recording and reflection essay. So, as we're thinking about, right, the dark side of interpersonal communication, come to the dark side, we have cookies. There might be some ways that we understand why it's important and what we can do to, at the end of the day, address it. So there's a lot of things that we can think about as the dark side of interpersonal communication. That could be things such as lying, betrayals, can even involve things related to aggression and abuse. And there is some grayness in what we might consider, right? One idea that gets brought up a lot is the idea of the white lie. So if somebody like a good friend, is a really bad cook, and you want to not insult them and say, oh, this is great, and then you throw it up later, right? That might be a way that you try to maintain the relationship while still being deceptive. So there's some challenges and gray areas there. But when we're talking about maybe the dark side or the negative parts of communication, things that we see and experience, unfortunately, on a really regular basis, things that we see oftentimes depicted on screen in TV shows and movies, right? What we're thinking about are negative outcomes of communication. So a lot of what we've been talking about in the class is the idea that our communication can ultimately benefit our relationships, right? You might think about ideas of self-disclosure, of the stages of relationships coming together, uncertainty reduction and social penetration theories, right? Get at the idea that the more we share and the more we put out to somebody else, the closer that relationship will become. But the inverse is also true, right? That negative outcomes and choosing to communicate in a way designed to hurt others can ultimately hurt the relationship overall. Things like intentional harm. So understanding some of those negative patterns of communication serves a couple functions, right? It helps us do a better job of advocating for and supporting good communication of those around us, right? We talk about a lot of times the idea of a call out or, calling somebody out on their behavior that is hurtful, but you can also think about it as a call in, right? Using it as an opportunity to have a more constructive relationship with that person. So saying, hey, you tend to use this strategy a lot where you are somewhat deflective and you don't answer questions when I'm trying to understand something important. What can we do about that? So it helps us to develop a framework for addressing issues that might come up in our relationships. And it's also an important element of our own self-reflexivity, right? It's the idea that, we're not perfect and we're going to make mistakes or say or do things that either intentionally or not, right, can hurt the other person. So thinking about ways to make our communication better and to address maybe our own problems and how we communicate with others is an important thing that we can build on as well, right? One of the things that gets discussed a lot, and I think can be a challenge in thinking about how to communicate well and sensitively, is the issue of intentionality versus impact, right? Oftentimes, If we say or do something that ends up hurting somebody else, one of our responses is easily, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. It wasn't intentional, right? And that's good, right? It's good to acknowledge that you were not trying to hurt the other person. But, right, that person is still feeling the impact of what it is that happened. So for instance, right, if you're walking down a hallway and you accidentally, bump shoulders with somebody and cause them to trip and fall, right, you can say, I didn't intend to cause you to trip and fall, right? And that might be helpful, but at the same time, that person is still hurt from falling on the ground. So impact still matters. The effects of our communication still matter to that other person. And one of our challenges then in how we communicate is better aligning both our intentionality and our impact, right? So there's a lot of ways we can think about doing so more effectively. Again, there might be an example such as using something like a homophobic slur, right? Where somebody is not trying to hurt the other person in that language choice. But they realize over time that maybe using that language is challenging or hurtful for somebody who's trying to come out and share their own sexuality, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we are deceptive in how we communicate. One of the ways that we do this, right, is by constantly testing relationships. We can think about these as like secret tests or almost like pop quizzes that we use in order to try to understand where we stand with the other person. And there's a lot of reasons that we might choose to use some of these strategies. One of the big ones might be that we're feeling insecure, right? We don't know where we stand with another person, and so we try to do a test to understand where that other person is coming from and how they feel about the relationship. Another reason might be that we haven't developed really direct communication with that person, right? We're still in early stages of the relationship, and we want to try to create a better pattern. Another idea, right, that could impact some of the tests that we use is attachment styles. So we might think about how somebody who has a preoccupied attachment style, where they value the other person but have lower self-esteem, might deal with and address their insecurities. So these are some things that we oftentimes hear and see a lot in media that impact our own relationships and essentially allow us to get a pulse on the relationship despite our methods maybe leading to a negative outcome. So I want to go through each of these and give you a couple examples of some of these strategies to better understand some of the ways that we use these every single day. So directness, right, is generally speaking the best of these approaches. Directness can be really positive, although depending on the context or the culture or situation, right, directness could also be seen as something that's inappropriate or not supportive of people in a group. Directness, if you were in a relationship, right, maybe a romantic relationship with somebody else, and that relationship is developing, you might ask questions. So where are we? Or who are we, right? What is our relationship? Where are we going? Those types of things. So directness is really asking about the relationship and trying to put your cards on the table to figure out where you and that other person are. And trying to figure out what your relationship looks like going forward. So for instance, are we exclusive if you're dating somebody else? Is a way to establish and figure out trust. Directness can be really useful, right, to feel like it's addressed your concerns. Directness can also be scary to the other person. So it's important to think about how, if you're choosing to be direct, you're leading to a positive impact on the relationship. So asking those kinds of direct questions might have a risk of pulling the other person away or making them feel like they are dealing with a lot of pressure. I'm not sure right now. I kind of want to see where this relationship goes. Might be a way that people respond to directness. Oftentimes, people that have looked at and researched on intimate relationships, right, tend to think about it as tug of war, where, if one side is pulling really hard, the other side tends to push back, right? If one side withdraws, the other side tends to try to pull forward, right? So oftentimes, we tend to respond to directness by withdrawing. So that can be a challenge as we think about how we're using directness in communication. Again, it can be a really good thing, but depending on the relationship, it can also close down on the options for communication. For instance, in a lot of collectivist cultures outside of the United States, there's the idea that directness and sort of an individual focus on responding to an issue could be seen as disrespectful, as selfish, and not able to account for the needs of the group as a whole. So directness can be useful, but it does have its limits, and it requires us to be sensitive to the needs of the other person. Another idea here, right, is endurance. So endurance deals with the question, can we get through this issue or problem together, right? And endurance is a test because we might intentionally do things that harm the relationship in order to see if either A, the relationship can't withstand that and therefore the relationship should end, or B, the relationship is so strong and we now feel so secure about that relationship that the endurance test has been passed. So, for instance, one pattern we see a lot is discussed through media is somebody that wants to end a relationship with somebody else. And rather than saying directly, hey, I don't like where this is going, I want to end the relationship, they might choose to directly do something that hurts the other person, such as flirting or dating somebody else, and using that as a way to get the other person angry and cause the people to break up. But this can also be used, for instance, if somebody chooses to be hurtful. We see, a lot of like love triangles depicted on television a lot, right? Where somebody might try to flirt with or get another person jealous, and in response, that person tries to work harder on the relationship. So endurance is really trying to use some tactics that might hurt the relationship so that the other person can show how much they care. So that can be an issue that we see again in a lot of insecure or pre-attached styles. And it can hurt the relationship if somebody is feeling like they're being tested in that way. An indirect suggestion. So one really easy example of this, right, is that in a lot of weddings, there's this common practice of, the couple throws out a bouquet of flowers and right, in the United States in particular, one of the common practices is that the person that catches the flower might be the one that is going to get married next. So, for instance, if somebody catches the bouquet and says, hey, look, I caught the bouquet, right? That gets used as a joke a lot of times, and then the other person kind of gets really anxious, right? Because they're like, oh no, they caught the bouquet, maybe we have to get married. So an indirect suggestion is oftentimes trying to hint at or push the relationship in a particular direction. So that could be one way that somebody hints about something. And there's a lot of ways that we use hinting or nodding to suggest more serious parts of the relationship that we want with somebody else. So maybe, you're spending time in somebody's house and they say, this would be so much easier. We wouldn't have to coordinate so much if we lived together, right? So that could be a way that they're testing the waters and trying to get the other person to change their action or behavior. So hinting can sometimes be useful, especially in a more collectivist culture, or situation where people feel like hinting can help move their relationship forward in a good way, but hinting also has the consequence of potentially being indirect or passive-aggressive, right? Where somebody is using hinting to avoid really sharing what it is that they want, and then causing the other person to feel frustrated if unrealistic expectations are put on them, right? A big source of miscommunication is somebody not necessarily responding to or understanding what that other person wants. I didn't realize you actually wanted us to move together. So that can be a source of disconnect that happens too. A public presentation, right? So if you're like me and you like to watch silly like Hallmark, Lifetime, Netflix, etc. types of holiday movies, this is a trope that we see a lot, right? So there's this classic trope. It seems to be in a lot of holiday movies, right, where somebody is going home for the holidays and they bring somebody else with them, like maybe like a fake boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And they're like, we're not really dating, they're just designed to help us and be our stand-in for the holidays. And then over the course of the movie, those two actually fall in love, right? There's a movie that came out called Single All the Way on Netflix. That's one example of this kind of trope, right? And the idea of a public presentation is a pretty important and big step. You might think about the stages of relationship development, right? One of them is the formal bonding stage, where people create a more direct relationship with each other through like an announcement, either through something like civil union, marriage, or sharing their relationship with others. Another example, right, is the use of social media. Again, I know that outlets like Facebook are not as commonly used for a lot of different reasons. But when I was growing up, right, it was a big deal when people would use social media, including Facebook, and say, so-and-so and so-and-so are in a relationship, right? Oftentimes that was used as a strategy. And if you think about kind of the dynamics of sharing in public presentations, there have been times where not everybody is on the same page. For instance, growing up, when I would see people share like a relationship status on Facebook, sometimes the other person would freak out and be like, oh, I'm not ready to go public about this yet. And then it'd get taken down. So oftentimes we have a lot of drama because we're not on the same page about how public or open we are about sharing information. Again, another big part of that would be choosing to share with family about the partnership and relationship overall. So public presentation can be effective if there's consent and understanding on both sides, but a public presentation can be negative if it's putting pressure on the relationship, right, or causing somebody to feel like they're not ready yet to get to that more public discussion. Another example, right, is one where somebody feels frustrated about the lack of public presentation. So for instance, there's a TV show on, I think, Hulu, right, called Shrill, where the main character is really upset in the first episode because she's like seeing somebody, and hooking up with somebody, but he asks her to like exit the home through the back so that nobody else sees her. So feelings of shame or frustration that the other person isn't being open about a relationship or being willing to share who they are can be a big source of anxiety for a lot of people. Separation, right? So separation involves using things like distance in order to test, again, the strength of the relationship. So for instance, you might be familiar with the phrase, distance makes the heart grow fonder. The use of things like distance or time away from somebody is a way to test and see if the relationship can endure or deal with some of those issues. For instance, long-distance relationships that we see, especially in this last year and a half, right, are an example of how we use separation. But separation is used as a test if it's this intentional creation of distance to see how the relationship holds up. So you might say, let's take a break, and use that as a way of trying to make the relationship hold up over that period of time. If you come back after a break and you realize you're really close with that person and really miss them, then that test works well. But right, trying to create separation in order to see if the relationship is strong can be really destructive as well. A third-party test is probably one of the most maybe negative or problematic of these approaches, right? And that's trying to get information from somebody else. So like an outsider about the relationship. Now sometimes that can be a really good strategy because a third-party test lets you sort of get an outside perspective about the other person and how they're doing. So for instance, it might be a way to identify destructive or abusive patterns in a relationship. If somebody's able to realize, hey, this person you're seeing, it seems like they really don't respect you. So a third-party test can be useful, but a third-party test can also potentially create a lot of pressure, right? Bringing in a friend or somebody else and having them essentially judge the relationship or the other person can be a situation that creates a lot of anxiety about both people in the relationship. And then lastly, I think probably the most destructive, or one of the most destructive approaches, is the idea of a triangle test, right? So again, my parents come from a background in therapy and counseling, and one of the things they used to tell me, right, is that groups of three triangles can be really destructive. Not always, they can be great and supportive, but dynamics like this one can come up, right, where You bring in a third person and you're trying to extract information about the relationship from that outside third person, right? So you're using things like gossip to try to get information about the relationship. What have they said about me? Like when I'm not around, right? What do they think of me? So sometimes that can be hard because the person in the relationship might feel like they want to share that information themselves, or they've shared information to the third party privately that they don't feel like should be exposed. And then the third person is put on the spot, right, where they're forced to share or disclose information that might be private and they might not feel comfortable with. So trying to extract that information from a third person can put a lot of pressure on everybody in order to test the relationship. So these different tests are ways of thinking about how oftentimes, right, we'll use tactics that might seem a little bit underhanded or indirect to examine the relationship as a whole. Another key idea here, right, is that tests and destructive parts of relationships come up. We have to figure out how we're able to apologize and respond to those in a constructive way. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen a lot has been the steps of effective apology, right? There's a lot of famous examples of apology that you might be thinking about. In our conflict management class, we've been talking about this too. You might think about the use of famous public apologies. One example, for instance, was Bill Clinton, right? When he attempted to apologize for perjury, right, and the affair with Monica Lewinsky. There's also use of apology from celebrities and figures such as Lance Armstrong, Tiger Woods, right? And one of the most recent examples is Travis Scott, right, and the Astroworld concert where multiple people died from suffocation because of how packed the venue was, right? He's tried to do a sort of public apology. One thing that's been brought up in some classes has been the idea that like there's this trope of the YouTube apology, right, where somebody is like on screen and they start crying and being very over the top in how they choose to apologize. Some people have even created tier lists of apologies on YouTube, which is kind of silly. But one of the challenges then that we face and think about more publicly is what makes a good apology. Knowing that sometimes we can hurt other people in how we communicate, intentionally or not, one effective strategy is to think about essentially three major stages. First of all, responsibility. It's my fault, right? You are taking ownership of the thing that happened, again, regardless of intentionality. Showing remorse, right? Saying, I feel really bad about this, or I'm really sorry that I hurt you, shows that you care about the impact of what it is that you said. And then a direct request for forgiveness, right? Will you forgive me if we work through this together? One important idea to consider is that not everybody is ready to forgive, right? If somebody is not quite at that place, such as something that's really destructive or hurtful, right? They might not be ready to forgive either immediately or even longer term, right? When Tiger Woods publicly apologized about multiple extramarital affairs, they worked through therapy, but his wife at the time and him were not able to work out those differences, right? So forgiveness, if we're expecting somebody to forgive us right away, they might not be there yet. And so it's important for us to think about how we give them space to forgive properly. Another key idea, and again, I think a missing thing in a lot of apologies when negative communication comes up, is to provide a framework of how they'll be able to fix or address the issue into the future. So here's how I prevent this from happening again. Can help an apology feel a lot more genuine. And again, we see a lot of empty apologies or corporate speak, right? I'm sorry you feel that way is the most infamous example because you're not expressing any sort of responsibility or really showing much remorse, right? I am sorry that ended up hurting you, right? Would not seem very connected to or show ownership for the apology that happened. So one of my classes brought up, right? If you take just about every apology from the Kardashians, there's probably a missing part here, right? So pictured here, right, is Anthony Weiner, who was a former, tragically last name given what happened, former U.S. congressman who had a major sexting scandal, right? It's a really strange and bizarre story, but it essentially involves him posting some inappropriate photos on his social media, claiming that he was hacked, and then it was discovered, right, that he accidentally logged into the wrong account and was sexting somebody else, right? He, of course, was married at the time. It generated a lot of criticism, and then it happened again. Again, it's a really strange story. Apparently his nickname when he was sexting was Carlos Danger, which is kind of silly. But that's this idea of internet infidelity, sexting, and so on. Something we see a lot more discussion and controversy about. But it's the idea of sort of using that outside of a relationship in a way that would hurt the relationship and pretending that it wouldn't. And again, depending on the relationship and the agreement that people have within that relationship, there are maybe ways that might be defined differently. Again, in a lot of relationships, monogamy can be defined differently, or a relationship might be non-monogamous, but it's the idea that the relationship goes beyond what's considered okay. So one of the issues, right, of infidelity, again, we could think about this in a couple different areas. A lot of times, right, culturally and societally, we might view something like sexual infidelity, like cheating on a partner, as worse than the idea of emotional infidelity, which we would think about more as not sharing your thoughts or concerns or being yourself around the other person. But both of those things can definitely be a problem. There used to be a stereotype that men cared more about sexual infidelity and women cared more about emotional infidelity, but depending on the relationship and situation, right, both can be really important to people in different ways. Having an open discussion, though, and being direct in that issue has kind of across the board, though, been generally considered to be the best way to deal with the issue. Somebody coming clean and choosing to share on their own that they did this was a way of most effectively ensuring that the relationship could sustain that problem. Again, if you think about tests, one test might be to intentionally cheat in order to see if the relationship could hold up or survive that, right? So there's a lot of destructive patterns that can happen too. So, in addition to this, right, there's specific kinds of hurtful messages. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these because I think a lot of them are ones that we're pretty familiar with and encounter on a regular basis. But there are important ways we can think about how negative interpersonal communication plays out. The first is an evaluation, right? That's sort of making a statement about the value or worth of another person. So if you were to dismissively say, you're not worth my time, right? That'd be an evaluation where somebody feels judged, and as a result of feeling judged or assessed as a person, they feel really hurt. Another approach is an accusation, right? Where you're blaming the other person for an action, especially at a point where it's not necessarily appropriate. So this is all your fault, right? And using an accusation in that way might hurt the relationship if it feels like that person is deflecting their own responsibility. So the use of directive, right? That would be a specific order or command. So this could be an especially challenging thing to navigate in like a parent-child relationship, right? Go away and never come back would be an example of a directive, where you're telling somebody what they should do. Oftentimes it's like an extreme ultimatum, right? Where you say, I don't ever want to see you again, right? Would be an example of using a directive in a potentially hurtful way. An informative statement, right? So information and disclosing information can be really helpful, but the use of gossip can also really hurt the relationship as a whole. There's something you should know, right? Or, I saw your boyfriend talking with this other person. We oftentimes will see this type of gossip being dishonest, or this type of gossip or information is shared as a way of trying to hurt or destroy a relationship. So information, if it's used in a specific way to hurt other people, can be a destructive pattern too. In addition to that, a statement of desire, right? is somebody who basically mic drops and shares something that they feel like is hurting the other person by being honest, right? I actually want to be with Joe, or I never liked you anyway. Oftentimes when we see like breakups depicted in media, there's like this final line where they say, oh, and by the way, I never liked your music, right? Where there's this dramatic statement at the end, and that the admission of honesty and what that person wanted was meant to hurt them, and is trying to show that maybe the interests were never aligned to begin with. An advising statement. So this can be especially related to power and relationships that have inequalities in power. You shouldn't be an astronaut, or, that doesn't seem like a very good idea for you. This ties back to the idea of microaggressions that we brought up on Monday, right, where people will make these kind of death by 1,000 cuts statements that are targeted toward people as members of a group, right? So an advising statement might be using somebody's status within a particular group in a negative or stereotypical way, right? For instance, using somebody's gender or race to imply how good they are at a particular subject, right? Like math would be an example of using an advising statement in a way that could be hurtful. Advising statements are essentially the function of a gatekeeper, where they're trying to direct what that person can or cannot say. This also ties, right, to a term that we've heard a lot over the past few years, right, the concept of gaslighting, or of intentionally causing another person to doubt their own perception of reality, right? Under something like gaslighting, somebody starts to doubt, wait, I thought that they said this. Am I mishearing things? I must be confused. And that's used oftentimes as a tactic by controlling or advising somebody else's emotions. A question, right? So a question can oftentimes be used, especially from like a parent, and this is another example of something that might be well-intentioned, but it can be used in a way that probes or hurts the relationship. Why haven't you been promoted yet? Or again, a staple of a holiday film, right? Why are you still single? That a parent might ask when they come home for the holidays. One kind of fun practice, right, would be to watch like a holiday special or silly romantic comedy related to the holidays, and basically track all the forms of hurtful communication that happen, because I'm sure you would probably get a lot of those. But a question is not necessarily meant to be informative. It's meant to make the other person feel bad or guilty in situations like these. A threat, right? Move it or lose it. If we see people like bully characters that oftentimes show up in media, right? That's an example of characters that oftentimes like to use a threat to provide harm if something does or doesn't happen. Obviously, the potential for harm can be a really negative thing on that person, psychologically, socially, and so on. Jokes, right? So again, one of the challenges that we've talked about over the last several years have been sort of the appropriate boundaries of telling jokes or directing jokes specifically at particular populations or demographics, right? So one example would be the use of things like name calling. So for instance, if somebody had a name for you, like they were calling you mophead because of your haircut, or they were trying to use some type of physical insult about you, oftentimes by using humor, right, the humor wasn't felt in an equal way. That person doesn't feel good that they're being called that name, their friends are. And so oftentimes joke can be hurtful if it feels like some people are enjoying it and another person feels really negatively impacted by it. Oftentimes, right, somebody using directness to address the jokes that they hear from somebody else can be a good strategy, right? Saying, hey, I know you all give me this silly nickname, but I don't really like it. Can we do something else? A lie, right? So lies, of course, are one of the most direct examples. We don't know each other, right? Where there's somebody that you're close with and you pretend that you no longer know them. That could be a direct deception. And again, while something like a white lie could be good depending on the situation, Oftentimes, right, lies have a way of snowballing and building up over time that causes some negative impacts on the relationship as a whole. So there's three major ways that we can think about responding to or addressing hurtful messages that might come up. An active verbal response, right, is directly addressing the issue. For instance, you could attack somebody else. If somebody calls you a name, you could respond by calling them a name. You could defend yourself and say, hey, you know, I don't appreciate when you lie to me. I'm, you know, not a fan of that. Asking for an explanation. So I heard that you've been saying some things about me behind my back. Why are you doing this? So an active response is really, you could think about as trying to address the issue in one way or another. And sometimes active responses can contribute to the harm too. An acquiescent response, right? So again, this could be a very emotive YouTube apology, right? But it would involve something like crying, conceding, or apologizing, right? Where you're giving in to that other person. That type of apology can be helpful to show the emotional impact, but at times, right, that approach might seem like it's using something like tears or emotion to stand in the way of really sharing or taking responsibility. And then an invulnerable response, right? If somebody's hurt you, showing that you don't really care. For instance, ignoring it, laughing at it, or otherwise trying to show the other person, hey, you've called me a name or insulted me. You might think about some classic schoolyard examples. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Using statements like that to show that your attempt to hurt me does not succeed. So those are the three most common ways that we respond to and address hurtful messages that come up for us. So what I'd like you to do now is on your own to write or type. First of all, given the 10 types of hurtful messages that we've talked about for today, which of those messages, in your opinion, has the potential to do the most harm? And why do you think that might be? I've listed those out there for you. So which of these has the most potential, in your opinion, to do harm? And then secondarily, we've gone through 3 different types of responses to verbal messages. What of these 3 would be the best way to respond to this kind of hurtful message that you've identified in the first question? So I'll give you some time to think through this. So I have the impression at this stage that a lot of folks are pretty exhausted and burned out. I know this time of the quarter, as we get into the last week, get into exams, final papers, all of that can really be a lot. So, you know, I recognize that, and I know that you're kind of in a difficult spot. So I'm not going to ask you to do a whole lot in terms of sharing or discussing those issues, but these are things that we can continue to think about and develop as we examine some of the negative patterns of communication a little bit more next class. So to wrap up for today, we talked a little bit about some of the hurtful messages that we can receive every day and that we oftentimes experience, some of the ways that we respond to hurtful messages, and then some of the negative impacts that these things can have, right? When we're trying to test the relationship or we're trying to be deceptive or harmful to the other person. Again, these are things that we encounter a lot, might do ourselves. So it's important for us to think about how we can be more reflective and thoughtful in addressing some of these challenges. For next class, we'll be continuing to look at negative patterns in communication. So one last reading that we'll be looking at some of these issues in more detail, including some of the strategies that we can use to combat some of these negative patterns. So as we get into the very end of class, I really recommend continuing to work on developing your topic for your discussion, making that discussion happen, ideally this week at the latest, and moving forward from there. So go ahead and pass forward your attendance activity for today. I hope that you have a good rest of your day. Hang in there. I know we're at a really exhausting and challenging point in the quarter, and I will see you again on Friday.